Hi, I'm Kaylin Johnson. I'm the lead cyber intelligence analyst at Sibylline, and today we'll be doing a deep dive discussion into the recent TikTok ban in the US and the wider impact it has on data protection regulations and the geopolitical implications. I'm joined today with three of my colleagues.
Hi everyone, I'm Guo Yu. I'm the lead APAC analyst.
Hi, I'm Sydney Stewart and I am the North American analyst at Sibylline.
Hi, I'm Tom Carter and I'm the associate analyst for the European desk.
Well, thank you for joining me today, guys. So recently, the TikTok ban that everyone's been talking about, how the US has implemented or proposed the Restrict Act, that they've banned TikTok on government devices, which has then seen an influx of other Western companies following suit. So to start, Sydney, because of this, with the Restrict Act, what's kind of just like the reasons behind why they might be doing this now?
Sure. So I would say that the Restrict Act is, it's a proposed federal regulation that would actually unify what is currently kind of a state-by-state patchwork of proposed and affected bans against, government employees having TikTok on their government devices and using that device on a government network, as well as universities have also proposed similar bans. So I think right now this is trying to create a kind of unified national landscape of tech regulation on TikTok. And it also comes at a time when there are a lot of strained relations between China and the US in particular. So it's definitely playing into the geopolitics as well.
So why now, and why focus on TikTok particularly, especially when the ban on of TikTok on government devices should be common sense? You should not have social media or fun apps on a work or government device. Like that should be common sense, I would assume. So why focus on TikTok especially?
Yeah. So TikTok comes after years of failure when it comes to US regulation on social media platforms and data protection. Again, we've seen some states like California who have affected actually quite strong data privacy and protection rules. But again, on the national level, we have not been able to create kind of smart and effective regulation for data privacy. So I think ultimately, why now with TikTok, it's all coming to a head where there are both real potential and overblown national security implications, which we can discuss here in a minute. But I think it's all kind of coming to a head with TikTok at the moment.
Cool, thank you.
I think the second point that Sydney made about, obviously the ongoing geopolitical tension between China and US really played a part, As you mentioned, data collection and data privacy issues is not just alone for TikTok to be concerned about. We also have issues with Facebook, with Cambridge Analytica, the whole scandal over that, and also other social media companies, or indeed companies, internet company collecting vast amount user data. They also face some level of scrutiny. So what you have is on the one level, there's a general kind of a movement towards tightening data security, data privacy laws across the whole globe. But on the other hand, you have this ongoing tension, or if we want to say it, even escalating tensions between China and US, and TikTok being owned by a Chinese company, obviously being under the spotlight more so than say Facebook, Google, and others, right?
Yeah. So with that, the big, as you said, because it's Chinese owned, there's a lot of worry that TikTok would be, asked upon the government to provide potentially information on users as kind of 2017 laws that they passed that
National
basically, if they ask upon you to provide that information within China, you're obligated to do it as a Chinese owned company. But like with that, was that not potentially putting implications on wider Chinese-owned companies and just the influence that it has on the global market? Like what could be the global implications of that?
I think particularly that's the point. There's a lot of mention about this word of theoretical threats. And citing this law, this Chinese legislation, could potentially demand, Chinese companies to supply, or to assist any, state investigation on national security matters. And obviously, TikTok being owned by Beijing-based ByteDance. But I think from TikTok's perspective, what they are trying to argue, and indeed trying to pledge, is to basically separate their operation. Obviously, TikTok is only available outside China. Inside China, they have something similar, a parallel platform which called Douyin, and these two users on each platform cannot access each other's data or content. So it's operates a completely different system. So TikTok trying to argue that it's actually, during the quite heated testimony or congressional hearing, the CEO said a lot of times about project taxes. So they're trying to separate their data storage, algorithm that TikTok operates and TikTok manages from other, ByteDance platforms like Douyin, which is located inside China. So at this time, whether this argument would be convincing enough for foreign government, especially Western authorities, we just don't know. I think the premises is not been very positive, the outcome, because you see a lot of government has banned TikTok on government devices, and some of the government like the US are thinking about banning TikTok in public sphere as well.
Just to build on that point quickly, so you mentioned about they wanted to separate operations. TikTok are currently undergoing something called Project Clover, and they are trying to reason with European governments that they will ensure data sovereignty. And I think that's a key issue behind a lot of what the European countries are feeling at the moment. And some of the solutions which they're talking about with European governments is to sort out data centres which are currently being placed there's 2 in Dublin and there's 1 in Norway, just as a means to separate the operations and ensure the kind of the consumer protection, which we arguably do not have at the moment.
Which is what happened in the States. They've got Project Texas, which is to
Oracle as well.
They'd like to implement data storage in the States, so then at least then the country has sovereignty and they can apply the regulations to the data centers that store their own citizens' data. Sorry, you were going to say something.
So in fact, ByteDance has already invested a tremendous amount of money in a contract with Oracle to create massive data centers to handle and process all US user data. But this has fallen on deaf ears to some extent, perhaps, or at least met with serious skepticism by policymakers.
Well, I think that's also part of the issue with a lot of this is policymakers aren't the security experts in terms of data security. And at least in the States, a lot of regulations aren't created by experts in the field. They're created by the policymakers who may not, as we saw in the congressional hearing, don't have a full understanding or grasp on the actual technology and what it does, the data storage and the processes behind it. Whereas in the EU, a lot of the regulations implemented by the EU and a lot of the commissions around here are done and written up by experts in the field. So is that maybe a huge part of the problem? Is that the people creating the policy, at least in the States, don't have a great idea on what's actually happening and the implications?
So I can speak from the Europe angle. So data protection is not a new idea in Europe. We saw the Digital Services Act, which was passed in 2022, which tries to standardize best practices of data regulation. And this is also similar within the financial sector. It's called the Markets Instrument. It's called MiFID, the Markets Instrument Directive Act, which looks at best practices within the financial sector and look at those gateholders who are in charge of the data privacy and trying to work out, as I said, a best practice to mean this data is secure.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think also the point about data sovereignty and data security is very important even for a lot of APAC countries, including China itself. Obviously, we all know China manage their own information narrative quite strictly, with quite comprehensive censorship, but also at the same time, in recent years, China brought up their own, data privacy and data security law, and actually much copied or much mirrored the European data security law in terms of terms and conditions and potential punishment. So you can see this is indeed an issue, but the point, TikTok being on the kind of the tip of this focus. A lot of has to do with geopolitics, with politics, unfortunately, and obviously with China US tensions, and so that's why one potentially could be arguing that TikTok is subjecting an actual layer of scrutiny or much tighter standards compared to other similar platforms, at least in the eyes of Washington or in the eyes of a lot of European governments.
To reiterate the kind of why now that we were just speaking about a few minutes ago, I think the parallel comparison between the European policy on tech regulation and US policy, as I said, the US is coming to a head where we have not been able to create meaningful, effective, smart tech regulation around data privacy, whereas like Tom was just saying, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act have actually created meaningful rules about thresholds for at what point does a platform have a significant enough user base that it is required to report on certain data practices, and where that data is stored must be stored within the EU and things like that. So I think the stark comparison is quite meaningful.
You make a good point. I mean, recently, so in the UK, TikTok has been fined 12.7 million for permitting underage, I think it's under the age of 13, to actually register for their for the platform. And I think that the grounding which the Digital Services Act and the Marketing Act has had is you can have a point of reference for these, which I don't think we've ever had, or is probably limited in the US.
Yeah, I think on a more positive side, the fact that we are looking in the US towards national regulation to mitigate this kind of patchwork effect is positive, though, because you might have some jurisdictions that actually propose overly stringent or, allegedly, bizarre regulation. Like in Utah, they just proposed, they passed a law requiring all minors to have the express consent of their parents in order for them to be able to be on social media platforms. So I think the issue of TikTok has definitely, accelerated that regulation and made it very also politically beneficial for policymakers to propose such stringent, excessive rules, but they might not have actually considered the negative repercussions of such a law.
Also a bit more certainty for business operating in that field, right? At least you're not expecting different states applying different standards, and you have to basically follow up all the development.
Exactly.
But then with this, obviously, it's become quite stringent. It's very vague, broad language in the Restrict Act in the States that could be kind of utilized for any company for within anything, to basically say, well, it's actually got national security risks, or anything that could affect interference with elections, to just excessively harvesting people's data. But it's so vague that it could be then applied to cryptocurrency usage. It could be applied to, Kaspersky and stuff is quite a widely used cybersecurity company. And whilst it's banned from use in the government as part of its security protocols, people still use it widely individually. But with this, it's talking about foreign adversaries, which Russia is a part of, and even though Kaspersky is separate from that, it muddies the water with the language that it's specific in who it's kind of looking towards in sort of form of foreign adversaries, but it's very vague in terms of how it can be applied, and again applied by people who don't necessarily have the actual technology kind of background to really fully understand it. So again,
Yeah.
politically kind of motivated and like the fear mongering side of it. But then the wider impact that has for global businesses, as we're a globalized community, that, you know, businesses that are Chinese based or operate within China, but also, you know, might be like headquartered elsewhere. But that then could affect business within China with as well as business with China.
Absolutely.
And then kind of have that like just like
Absolutely.
domino effect that
I think you raise a very kind of important issue and an emerging issue what we have. You know, let's not forget TikTok is not the only Chinese-owned, you know, social media or internet companies that is becoming very popular in the U.S. and elsewhere. You know, we have, you know, quite a few, you know, very big and emerging and popular e-commerce platforms, and then we have, you know, other Chinese, you know, social media companies. So they will be thinking, you know, what next if the U.S. ban TikTok, not just on government devices, but, you know, outright, you know, restrictions. Then what about WeChat? You know, there was a lot of talk about WeChat, you know, a few years ago when Trump was in power. He suggested to ban TikTok and WeChat, and that received a lot of opposition and even, you know, protests from the Chinese diaspora. Which is, you know, quite a significant portion of the population in the U.S. Communities and not wanting, you know, this ban to go through because, you know, WeChat, they use WeChat as an important platform or tool to communicate with family back to China or other Asian communities.
China's heavily censored, like TikTok's banned within China, and like they can only use certain applications to speak to their family. And when you've got a huge amount of people living abroad, they need to talk to their family, right, and stay in touch. And if that's the only one that their families are allowed to use, then it would significantly kind of affect family ties as well, which is just one of those domino effects that I don't think people really consider. That's like would then potentially affect immigration, have, you know, another, again, variety of domino effects. It's a bit wild.
Yeah. I mean, what we're seeing is, you know, policymakers trying to securitize the digital space along geopolitical and geographical lines. But by virtue of being, you know, a global internet and the digital space, you cannot simply divide it in half. But we're attempting to do that at this point. Well,
the whole point is that like internet was created to be decentralized, was created to kind of create this global like ability to communicate, to work together, to do all these things. And as you said, the internet doesn't have borders, but we are trying to fit it within certain borders, and it kind of negates the whole like why it was created and kind of like how it's been utilized in the first place. That it's kind of just then creating this, are we going back from a globalized community to kind of siloing ourselves off again? Like, are we kind of stepping back from this globalized perspective?
I mean, on the other hand, it's very, you know, we can have rose-tinted glasses about the invention of the internet, but also today there are very serious ramifications that I think we do definitely need regulation, but the question should be what type, how much,
Who
what are the
regulates
technicalities, who is drafting regulation, and what are the ramifications, legal compliance risks, creating a level playing field within the US, within Europe.
It just brings a wider conversation as well of like the use of the internet, why, but then like the deep web, dark web, you know, even with sanctions and people being arrested, it doesn't stop people from using it. So with the ban on TikTok, they're like, it's a widely used platform, wouldn't stop people necessarily from using it. And they, like the government for like the US has said that they want it to, you know, it's more applied to businesses like rather than targeting individuals. But it could eventually target individuals. So then it has a case of like, is it people are worried about, you know, First Amendment, like freedom of speech, like a free market, free access to the internet. So it's just one of those conversations that's like, we're talking about data security and privacy, but it's not just that, is it, anymore? Like what it could potentially lead to. So Tom, what about the like impact this has on businesses? Because you mentioned like advertising as well. How does that affect with this?
So I think there's a point to be made. There's depending on what sort of level of scrutiny we actually get into and what may come of these TikTok investigations, maybe look at the Irish Data Protection Commission, I think I think we should potentially look at the spillover into other businesses, and notably the tech companies and businesses which are in part or in large in part driven by advertising as a main source of revenue. Controlling cookies is something we're all aware of, and controlling these types of data platforms could have a knock-on impact on these broader tech and advertising businesses.
Which is a really good point, since, I mean, obviously that's how you market. And if you're marketing to, a younger generation who that's usually one of their main means of seeing the world and kind of, what they ingest, it would then affect, what businesses can operate and who they're marketing towards as well, which...
Particularly when you consider small and medium-sized organizations that really need advertising in order to connect with an audience or find those potential customers. I know in Europe it's also been an issue with regards to, people who are practicing like certain types of art and craft that has to do with cultural heritage as well, and enabling them to find their audience and find consumers.
But also at the same time open another sort of layer of debates on regulation, because advertising on social media platform itself, there's a lot of being questions raised, whether there's should be an appropriate level of control, targeting audience, for example, what sort of advertisement should not be broadcast to platforms that are used a lot by people under the age of 18, etc., etc.
Yeah,
so,
with like Google as well, a lot of your advertisements tend to be personalized, but then it's like how young is too young to get certain like advertisements for, because you can't control it, which is a really good point to make, because it is like, it's just an added layer. And you mentioned as well, there's more regulation that's coming directly from Biden as well related to this.
Yeah, so not regulation per se, but Biden has basically suggested that he might force ByteDance to divest U.S. operations of TikTok by executive order. So, that's an additional layer of, policy risk that we're seeing that would, entirely bypass Congress, because it's a different type of tool. But it's also worth mentioning that since 2020, TikTok has been negotiating with the Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S. that began, I believe, just at the tail end of the Trump administration. So, it's also worth noting that TikTok's, discussions with the U.S. government are not new. They have been ongoing, but I think we're seeing, a real kind of national sensationalism to a degree at the moment.
And just on that point, if I may, just very quickly, China come back with quite strong opposition, obviously, that kind of expected, especially towards the potential of being forced to, sell off the U.S. operation. I think the government said they obviously this kind of force, what they call a force transfer of technology and data. They will obviously try to protect their own company's interests, etc. And then. Funny enough, and such a statement kind of being interpreted during the hearing as potential kind of evidence of link between the Chinese government and ByteDance and TikTok, and being sort of and put the CEO on the spot. So you can see it's a very kind of intriguing kind of competition going on there, and technology, social media platform, unfortunately become a part of the jigsaw between these two, superpower rivalry.
Which is interesting, and just to kind of like finish, because I know we're kind of getting short on time. Sydney, you mentioned, to kind of circle back to the social media aspect and like data, harvesting and stuff by loads of companies is not new. Cambridge Analytica did that, and you, Sydney, were talking about an example of this that was quite funny, but also quite relatable for a lot of just everyday people. Some people don't have TikTok, but like other social apps and kind of, stuff with like related to Strava and all this. But you said that you had a really funny story that was like, please talk about it.
So to contextualize why it is a potential cybersecurity issue to have a social media or dating app on a government device, is that on the back end, it's possible to peel the data off of the app somehow. Caitlin's a cyber expert. I'm sure she can explain exactly how somebody can peel the data out of the phone. But you can actually take all the personal information that somebody puts in, say, a dating app or also social media app, can be taken. So that includes exact coordinates of somebody's location, their gender, their date of birth, where they're from, any personal information that you're putting in that app, for dating or for social purposes, can be, it's personally identifiable information that can be abused.
And we willingly give it away as well. So, and it's just a case of we don't necessarily know how much of it is accessible, like in the past with the MyFitnessPal app and how that leaked and shared data of where army bases were in the US and the Middle East, because the army, they were using the app for their running to track, how long they're running, their times, all of that. And it shows them directly on the map where then the base is. And then that's then again a security risks for like military, but it's one of those that you should maybe not be using applications on government or even corporate devices where you might have data that you don't want to be taken from you, or at least know that it's secure. But yeah, so it just brings the wider implications on just using social media for any sort of government-owned device or a company device, and then the implications that has about using and inputting your own data and on a phone that is owned by the company then creates other risks as well. So it's an interesting conversation to have, but also one that you could go on for ages about, because the implications at a security level, at a political level, company-wide, it creates a huge conversation then as well when it comes to censorship, when it comes to globalization and kind of how we interact with the wider world. There's a lot that could be said for this that I really appreciate your guys' time as well as input, because I could go on about it for ages and I have so many other questions for you, but I really appreciate you guys taking the time today to just scratch the surface on some of the implications and just kind of more context about what's going on. So thank you all so much for being here today.
Pleasure. Thank you.